So great to be with you today.
Hey, so great to be with you.
Thanks for joining me.
Yeah,
Cheers.
It's a pleasure.
It is. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So we're in this Rooted series.
We are.
And we've just started it.
Mm-hmm.
And we've started in the book of Genesis.
Yep.
What happens in the book of Genesis? What are some details that we might want to pay attention to right as we begin?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And I think digging into Genesis as we launch this series is so important because it really does set the stage for what the rest of the Bible is about.
Okay.
So if we're going to understand a book, this is a good one to understand.
Okay.
And it can be tricky because it's got a lot of different movements. But
What makes it tricky?
I'll tell you, well...
You're going to get to that.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that. But, you know, many of us know it starts with the creation narrative. So that poem in the first chapter of Genesis, which God speaks and through his word creates out of this void comes beauty and creation and life, right? And that's a really important theme. And then kind of the goodness of the pinnacle of goodness in that creation narrative is God creating the man and the woman, right? And Adam and Eve, and we know how that story, I was going to say evolves, but really it devolves a bit when God says to the man and woman in this garden, you have everything you need here to flourish, right? And then he says, and you're here to cultivate and care for the plants and the animals, but this tree, right? Don't eat from this tree. And of course, we know the story goes, they're tempted by the serpent and they eat from that tree. And again, they're really important that we understand that part of the story without going into too much detail. But just this notion that there was a decision made in that moment where Adam and Eve could either trust God saying, you have everything you need and I'm going to care for you. Or they could trust the serpent who said, God doesn't know. God doesn't care. And you'll be better off if you do this thing, right? And take matters into your own hands. And so they do that. And kind of in that moment, this sort of spiral begins where we see kind of what humanity is capable of. When we don't trust God. And I think it's really important to name, oftentimes that's where we start when we tell the story of the gospel. We start with like, humans are bad and sinful, but really God creates and affirms and says, you're very good. And you're made in the image of God, which is a really important and profound kind of marker of our own identity, right? And that's where the story begins. But then we also see that there's another side to it, that when we, God encourages us to practice restraint. He says, don't eat from that tree. And restraint is actually a really good and important thing for us as humans to practice, because without it, the world spirals, and that's what happens.
Right. And so that's in the first 3 or 4 chapters of Genesis, right? And then in the next, up till chapter 12, where we are this week.
Yeah. So that kind of, you have Cain and Abel in there, right? And many of you will know that story. And so we see just, again, at kind of every juncture, each generation is given this opportunity to do things differently and to practice love of neighbor and make decisions that are honoring to God, but they don't. And so that brings us to, the story of Noah, where things have really come to just kind of this bad place. And it says there's this man who's a friend of God, and he's essentially the only person in existence at that moment in time that is honoring God. And so God chooses Noah, and many of us know that story from our childhood, and says, look, I'm going to protect you as I send this flood to wash away all the evil.
There's so many moving things about each of those stories. Like, as you're telling me them, I'm feeling the story. And I also have a lot of questions that pop up. Yeah. And I think that's so good.
Yeah.
And then while I'm reading something, and I'm hoping that I'm going to be formed by the text. Like, I'm hoping that I'm going to be somehow transformed. Maybe, what's my part to play, and what are the questions I can ask as I'm reading that text?
Yeah.
That might be important.
Yeah. It's such an important question to ask when we read Genesis, especially, because I think many of us, maybe this is our first time reading the Bible, or maybe we've grown up in a particular church context, but regardless, we get caught up in that question of, like, what is true? Like, did God actually create the world in 6 days? Or, is this more metaphorical? And obviously there's scholars across the boards that have thoughts on that. And I would say those are important questions. The question, did this really happen? Did the flood really happen?
Yeah.
But I don't think they're the most important question. And I think when we come to a book like Genesis, we have to understand that we, as modern readers, have been shaped by many things, the foremost of which is just kind of that period of the Enlightenment, right? In which we came to understand that the most important kind of truth was scientific, empirical, textbook truth. But the writers of Genesis and Exodus, these ancient storytellers, they weren't thinking about truth in those terms. And it's not, that doesn't make it a lesser truth. That doesn't mean things in Genesis didn't happen. But the truths that they were trying to get at were truths like, who is God and who are we? And how do we understand ourselves in light of who God is? And how do we live in light of who God is revealing himself to be through these stories? And so, Genesis 1 is such a good example. There's, the question that we often ask again is did this happen? Like, was it a 6-day creation? But if you look at themes in that story, themes in that poem, you'll see that one of my absolute favorite parts of Scripture is that Genesis 1 tells us there was evening and there was morning the first day. There was evening and there was morning the second day. And so we can get caught up in, did God really create, all the birds on this day? Or we can get caught up in the truth that God's saying, actually, a day doesn't end with night in God's economy, in God's kingdom. A day ends with the morning, right? And that's a beautiful thought as we think about concepts like hope and where the world is headed and what our part is. There's this way that God kind of sets up all of creation so that we're always moving towards the dawn, right? Which is a really beautiful concept, especially in even the times that we find ourselves in today where it can feel really hopeless. So then you fast forward to a book like John or Luke where the resurrection happens, and it says that the woman showed up with the spices to anoint Jesus's body. And when did that happen? In the early morning, right?
Yeah.
And so there's just these kind of beautiful things that are revealed about God and the world and creation if we can have eyes to see what those writers were after.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you is that if we're looking for what are redemptive pieces in the Scripture, if we're looking, we might see for ourselves those night versus morning ideas as we read for ourselves through the text, those themes. That's a really beautiful perspective.
Yeah.
It was so great to sit and have this conversation with you today. Do you have any encouragement as we continue to read the text?
Yeah, I think stay with it, keep reading. The Bible is packed with different genres of literature, and I know people who hate poetry, and there's a lot of poetry in there. People who prefer poetry to, lament or to just narrative. And I would say stay with the story. There will be things that are confusing. There'll be questions that come up, and make note of those. Don't ignore them. But don't give up, because I think the longer we can kind of stay enmeshed and sort of absorbing what it is that we're reading, some of those larger themes will become clearer. And I think as that happens, some of those details that seem a little bit unclear or frustrating even begin to make a bit more sense in light of kind of this overarching narrative that is, there's nothing like it in the world. Yeah.
Thank you. I will take that to heart.
Yeah.
Appreciate you being here today.
Yeah. So fun. So fun. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.